Moss is one of, if not my favorite plants. From self-watering moss walls to an end table full of this stuff, it's an absolute joy to build projects around, and lately, I've had a nagging feeling like it was time for another moss-centric build. That's because the snow has begun to melt, revealing clusters of moss around my yard. This inspired me, and that nagging feeling was forced into action when I noticed some beautiful Bria moss growing just outside my workshop. An idea immediately came to mind. Why not make something like those aquarium Driftwood Bonsai trees to house mini moss worlds? Something kinda like these. I've made similar arrangements in the past, but not with platforms. Before I could even think about those, I had to make a Driftwood base. Luckily I had some old spiderwood that could work. However, I did have to remove remnants from past scapes like narite snail eggs, dried moss, superglue, and expanding foam. Even so, I did my best to retain the patina they've developed from past lives in paludariums and aquariums. I think it tells a cool part of their story, and I didn't want to lose that. The idea was to bunch these together, creating a single seamless structure. For that to work, it needed a foundation. I selected pagoda stone because of its layered appearance. I felt this would help create an interesting penjing-like feel. This foundation allowed me to nest a chunkier piece with ease, where it then became my key element, dictating the placement of everything else. The second branch fit well next to this, but it didn't want to stay on its own. I had to prop it up with a rock temporarily. The third, however, wouldn't work as is. The small branches at the bottom prevented it from sitting properly, so I removed them. The adjustment helped, and I could see the promise in the arrangement. That's when I began securing the pieces with pond foam. It sets quickly, so after only a few minutes the support stone was no longer needed and any excess could be removed. This takes me back to the platforms I mentioned before. I'd make them from wood cookies, and incorporating them meant the branches had to be cut. The scroll saw was the best option for loose branches like this one. I foamed it to the others before securing the cookie with superglue. Like that, the first platform was ready to go. Unfortunately, I couldn't use the saw for some of the other pieces and had to take a different approach. I set a laser level to mark lines parallel to the first shelf and cut it by hand. Kind of a convoluted process, but it worked well enough. Then I worked to integrate that piece from before. Since it wasn't attached, I was able to make any modifications before foaming it in. I wanted some of the branches to hold these tiny jars. I just didn't have small enough cookies, so I had to make more. Luckily, I had some offcuts in the shop that were the correct diameter. I figured I'm already in the shop and might as well start using a CA activator. I'd never use it directly in the animal room because of the fumes, but it significantly sped up the process. These steps continued piece by piece until I decided to adjust a few things. First was everything on the right. I didn't care for how it looked, so I removed it. That made room for another platform. I also thought this tall skinny branch seemed out of place and cut it shorter. Finally, I had to hide the expanding foam. I smashed some aqua soil into dust and glued it on. As you saw throughout that process, these platforms are meant to hold various jars. While they appeared right at home on this, I couldn't help but feel like something was missing. I figured why not put dry moss on the outside to complement the live moss I'd soon put in the jars. Before I could do that, I had to create false bottoms. I selected black sand to keep them discreet. These small containers don't require too much. Just enough to separate any standing water from the substrate. This creates a reservoir where water is stored as it cycles through the system. If the container is sealed well and the initial watering is the correct amount, the terrarium can sustain itself indefinitely, which is pretty cool. I find it kinda hard to keep my hands out of them though, and have to add water during maintenance. Anyway, after evening out the sand, they were ready for a layer of charcoal. I tend not to make dedicated layers like this quite as often anymore. I find that it gets the same benefits when mixed directly into the substrate while providing additional stability against compaction. Since these will be moss-only systems, I wasn't as concerned with that. The substrate is a blend of cocoa fiber, bark, sand, and sphagnum moss. I didn't want to make anything crazy here. I was simply envisioning flat, mossy landscapes. After all, the whole point of this project was simply to come up with a cool way to showcase moss. However, I did do something different with the large jars. I added substrate to the bottom and made a dramatic slope to cover the entire back with moss. I kind of explained how this project came to be, but I'll elaborate. You see, I've been spending the winter building a catalog of large projects and long-term updates, hoping to spend more time on outdoor stuff later this year. I was looking for vines for a vivarium build when I came across one of those bonsai planters. Then I was outside building racks when I saw this moss. I had a good stopping point and figured I might as well take a break to do something simpler. Plus, collecting moss from outside just after winter is one of the best times, and Bream tends to do exceptionally well in terrariums. I thoroughly enjoy making elaborate projects because they help me develop new ideas and push my creativity, but there's something incredibly satisfying about builds like this. I know I can't be the only one who thinks a moss-only terrarium is so appealing. Creating the slopes in the larger containers was quite easy. I simply turned the containers on their sides and pressed moss into the substrate. As it grows together, it tends to be strong enough to keep everything good and stable. Of course they'd need water, which I added sparingly with a dropper. I could always add more later, and overwatering a terrarium is probably the most common place to go wrong, aside from placing it in a location with too much light. Another is mold development early on. Adding springtails is extremely helpful for that. These little critters take care of anything that may come up and become an integral part of the nutrient cycle. Building all of that was fun, but my favorite part might just be sealing them up. It's kind of like the feeling when you finish a book and slam it shut. A close second for this project was placing the finished terrariums on the stand. It showcased them and the moss about as well as I had imagined. However, I felt that the dried stuff just didn't look right. I decided to replace it with dried lichen instead. This winter has been a great time for me to focus on being productive. I've remained in a flow state for weeks, which has been invaluable. However, inspiration often comes unexpectedly, and while I don't always stop to embrace it, I let the moss have its way this time. I hope that you may find something that inspires you as well. If you enjoyed this video, you'll also like the time I put waterfalls on my coffee table, and when I turned an IKEA display case into a greenhouse. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, Serpa Squad, take care and peace.